The rules of engagement did not anticipate the specific situation that presented itself at 3:44 a.m., and the 11 minutes between first detection and weapons release authorization would later become the most documented 11 minutes in the destroyer's deployment record. The ship is operating in the Persian Gulf, 62 nautical miles northeast of Bahrain, conducting a freedom of navigation transit through the Central Gulf Corridor. The surface picture at 3:33 a.m. showed 4 petroleum extraction platforms on the Qatar North Field, labeled in the commercial database as NFPA-11 through NFPA-14, positions logged, standing maritime notices in effect for a 500-meter exclusion zone around each structure. The platforms had been in operation for 11 years. The standing operational intelligence assessment, active extraction facilities, civilian infrastructure, protected under international maritime law, no assessed military modification. The intelligence assessment had last been updated 19 days earlier. At 3:44 a.m., the SPY-6 surface search radar observed all 4 platforms simultaneously shift their thermal signature profile. Not a gradual change, a rapid, coordinated change that the radar's environmental monitoring mode flagged as a departure from the thermal baseline that had been logged across 240 hours of prior transits through this corridor. 4 platforms simultaneously, increasing their topside thermal output in a pattern inconsistent with petroleum extraction operations. 11 seconds later, the radar began resolving airborne contacts, not from the direction of the Iranian coast or the Yemeni landmass, from the platforms themselves. 80 contacts, rising from all 4 structures in near simultaneous release sequences of approximately 20 platforms per structure. Altitude climbing through 50 meters. Speed building to 185 kilometers per hour. Profile consistent with commercial derivative fixed-wing one-way attack UAV platforms, GPS guidance with terminal electro-optical seeker. 80 contacts from 4 civilian petroleum infrastructure platforms in Qatari waters under Qatari operating permits, 62 nautical miles from Bahrain, in the middle of the Persian Gulf's most commercially trafficked corridor. The fire control system generated the engagement solution in 0.8 seconds. The engagement solution required a decision that the fire control system could not make and that the rules of engagement had not specifically authorized. The rules of engagement in this theater contained 4 paragraphs specifically governing engagement of contacts that originated from or were associated with civilian infrastructure. The governing principle was the law of armed conflict standard for proportionality and distinction. The standard required the commanding officer to determine that a target had lost its protected status through direct participation in hostilities before authorizing engagement against it or against contacts launched from it. The platforms had launched 80 UAV platforms on a direct approach bearing toward the destroyer. That fact, standing alone, satisfied the direct participation standard. The platforms had lost their protected status from the moment the first contact lifted off. The complication was not legal, it was practical. The 4 platforms had been continuously operating petroleum extraction facilities for 11 years. They had hundreds of metric tons of flammable hydrocarbon in their piping, storage, and processing systems. They had workers. The NFPA-11 platform had 87 personnel aboard on its most recent manifest, filed with the Qatar Petroleum Authority, which the intelligence section had on record. NFPA-12 had 94 personnel. NFPA-13 had 112. NFPA-14 had 81. 374 workers on 4 platforms that had just launched 80 attack UAVs. The TAO's weapons release authority covered the 80 contacts. It did not cover the platforms. Engaging the platforms to neutralize the launch infrastructure, The option that would prevent a reload and a second salvo required authorization from a level of command above the ship because the platforms retained civilian infrastructure status in their physical structure, even after their launch activity had removed their protection under the law of armed conflict, and because 374 workers were aboard structures that contained enough flammable hydrocarbon to produce secondary detonation effects that would be catastrophically lethal, regardless of how carefully any strike was targeted. The TAO could engage the 80 contacts. He needed higher authority to engage the platforms. He had 11 minutes before the contacts entered SM6 engagement range, and 11 minutes did not provide sufficient time for the authorization chain to resolve. Weapons free on all airborne contacts bearing 228 to 252. Platforms are not authorized targets at this time. I need command authority on the platform question. Get me fleet. He transmitted the authorization request at 3:44 a.m. plus 40 seconds. He began the engagement against the contacts at 3:44 a.m. plus 53 seconds. The 11-minute gap between detection and the contacts entering SM6 engagement range was enough for the outer ring. It was not enough for the command authority question. The chain of command that governed authorization to engage civilian infrastructure with potential mass loss of life required a legal review, a proportionality assessment, and a command decision at the 3-star level. 3-star authority would not respond in 11 minutes on a pre-dawn transmission from a destroyer in the Persian Gulf. The TAO understood this when he transmitted the request. He was creating a documented record, not requesting operational approval that he expected to receive in time. The platforms would not be engaged during this engagement. The question of what happened after this engagement, whether the platforms would still have launch capability, whether a second salvo was possible, whether the command authority would be obtained before that happened, was a problem for the next 2 hours of communications. For now, 80 contacts, 11 minutes. The weapons he was authorized to use. Running count, 3:44 a.m., second 67, 80 UAV contacts, bearing 228 to 252, range 38 kilometers, and climbing, speed 185 kilometers per hour, altitude 120 to 450 meters. Origin, 4 petroleum platforms, NFPA 11 through NFPA 14. Platform engagement not authorized. Airborne contact engagement authorized. Time to SM6 range 11 minutes. SM6 8, SM2 24, ESSM 32, RAM 21. CIWS 100%. Fleet authorization request transmitted. Cost $0. The 80 contacts were organizing as they climbed. Not a single mass. 4 groups of approximately 20, 1 from each platform, each group ascending to a cruise altitude of 400 to 450 meters and stabilizing at 185 kilometers per hour. The 4 groups were on slightly divergent bearings, not the tight arc of a precision-planned strike, but the natural spread of 4 independent launch sequences from 4 platforms separated by 4 to 7 nautical miles. The groups would converge toward the destroyer's position over the next 18 minutes of approach, the arc compressing from approximately 24 degrees of bearing spread to something tighter as range decreased. The platforms were 22 to 28 nautical miles from the destroyer at the moment of launch detection. At 185 kilometers per hour, the contacts would still be climbing through their approach altitude for the first 4 minutes of the engagement. They were not yet in their cruise configuration when the TAO's engagement solutions were being computed. The fire control system was tracking 80 contacts with varying altitudes and speeds as each platform's launch group reached its cruise parameters independently. This was not standard Shahed 136 employment doctrine. Standard employment launched platforms from a single ground site in a coordinated mass with preset approach parameters already loaded. The platform launch architecture had produced a slightly less coordinated mass. Groups at different altitudes, slightly different speeds, the four-platform origin producing four mini-swarms that would merge rather than a single coordinated wave. The fire control system handled it. But the track files in the first 4 minutes of the engagement had more variance than a standard engagement, and the SM6 engagement solutions were being computed against contacts whose parameters were still stabilizing. At 3:52 a.m., with the contacts at 58 to 64 kilometers, all four groups had stabilized at 185 kilometers per hour, altitude 400 to 450 meters. The fire control system's track quality went from amber to green across 73 of the 80 contacts within a 40-second window as the approach parameters settled. 7 contacts remained amber quality tracks, 3 from NFPA-13's launch group that had maintained lower altitude, and 4 from NFPA-11's group that were displaying intermittent GPS update signatures consistent with platforms carrying slightly older guidance hardware. The amber contacts were not unengageable. They were at reduced intercept confidence, not zero. SM6 cells 1 through 6 against 6 high-confidence contacts at 58 to 62 kilometers, targeting the lead elements of the NFPA-12 and NFPA-14 groups, which had the most direct approach vectors to the ship's current position. 6 launches in 2.2 seconds. Running count, 3:52 a.m., second 481, SM 6x6 in flight. 80 contacts, range 58 to 64 kilometers. Fleet authorization, no response yet. 73 green quality tracks, 7 amber. SM6, 2 remaining. SM2, 24. ESSM, 32. RAM, 21. CIWS, 100%. Cost, $12.6 million. Time, 8 minutes. SM6 results at 3:53 a.m. 4 intercepts, 2 misses. Both misses were amber quality tracks. The contact's unstable guidance signatures had produced track extrapolation errors that placed the SM6 terminal baskets 20 to 28 meters from the actual contact positions. 76 contacts remaining. SM6 cells 7 and 8. The last 2 SM6 against 2 lead contacts from the NFPA-11 group at 54 kilometers. The group showing the highest proportion of amber tracks, targeted specifically because the SM6's active seeker performed better against GPS guidance on certain contacts than the SM2's semi-active system would. 2 intercepts. SM6 inventory, 0. 74 contacts remaining. Fleet had not responded. The platforms had not been engaged. The contacts were now 51 to 58 kilometers away and closing. SM2 cells 1 through 12 against 12 contacts at 44 to 52 kilometers, targeting the highest velocity approach vectors from the NFPA-12 and NFPA-14 groups. 9 intercepts, 3 misses, 65 contacts remaining. The Seahawk launched at 3:54 a.m. and transited southwest toward the platform cluster. The helicopter's mission was not engagement. It carried ASW ordnance, not surface or air weapons. Its value was observation and, if needed, damage assessment on the platforms themselves. The TAO had sent it to document what was on the platforms. The documentation would support the command authority request. SM2 cells, 13 through 22 against 10 contacts at 36 to 44 kilometers. 7 intercepts, 3 misses, the 3 amber track contacts from the NFPA-13 group continuing to produce intercept uncertainty at longer SM2 range. 58 contacts remaining. Running count, 3:57 a.m., second 793, SM60, SM2, 2 remaining. 58 contacts at 22 to 28 kilometers. Fleet. Question transmitted, no authorization. Amber track contacts, still producing SM2 misses. ESSM 32, RAM 21, CIWS 100%. Cost $36.0 million. Time 13 minutes. At 3:57 a.m., fleet responded. Not with authorization. With a question. Could the targeting system distinguish between the workers' quarters on the platform structure and the launch areas? The question indicated the authorization process was proceeding. It also indicated that the process had not yet produced a decision and would not produce one in the remaining engagement timeline. The TAO answered factually. No. The ship's weapon systems could not make that distinction at 22 nautical miles in darkness. He transmitted the answer and returned to the engagement. SM2 cells, 23 and 24. The last two SM2 cells against 2 contacts at 28 kilometers, both from the Amber Track NFPA-13 group that had been producing consistent SM2 misses throughout the engagement. 1 intercept, 1 miss. SM2 inventory, 0. 57 contacts remaining at 22 to 28 kilometers. Running count, 3:58 a.m., second 849, SM60, SM2, 0. 57 contacts, range 18 to 24 kilometers. Fleet, question transmitted, no authorization. Platform status, unchanged, continued emission from platform structures consistent with active launch infrastructure. ESSM 32, RAM 21, CIWS 100%. Cost $40.8 million. Time 14 minutes. ESSM cells 1 through 16 against 16 contacts at 14 to 20 kilometers. 12 intercepts, 4 misses. The amber quality contacts continued to produce below nominal ESSM performance. 41 contacts remaining. ESSM cells 17 through 28 against 12. More contacts at 10 to 14 kilometers. 8 intercepts, 4 misses. 29 contacts remaining. The 4 misses from this salvo included 2 contacts that had descended to sea-skimming altitude below 30 meters. The NFPA-13 group had apparently been loaded with platforms carrying sea-skimming terminal guidance, a variant of the standard approach profile that the SM2 Amber tracks had suggested. Sea-skimming contacts from 4 separate origin points. The ESSM had cleared 18 contacts from the 28 fired. 11 rounds had missed. The miss rate across the ESSM phase was running at 39%, significantly above the standard 15 to 18%. The amber quality tracks and the sea-skimming variants were driving performance below baseline in a combined effect that neither factor alone would have produced to this degree. ESSM cells, 29 through 32. 4 remaining cells against the 4 sea-skimming contacts at 7 to 9 kilometers. 2 intercepts, 2 misses, both contacts executing terminal evasion inside 6 kilometers. Lateral oscillations that moved them outside the ESSM proximity. Fuse lethal radius in the terminal phase. 27 contacts remaining. ESSM inventory, 0. Running count, 4:01 a.m., second 1033, SM6, 0. SM2, 0. ESSM, 0. RAM, 21. CIWS, 100%. 27 contacts at 2 to 6 kilometers. Sea skimmers, 4 contacts below 30 meters. Fleet authorization, still pending. ESSM miss, rate this phase, 39%. Cost, $54.6 million. Time, 17 minutes. RAM cells 1 through 12 against 12 contacts at 4 to 7 kilometers. 9 intercepts, 3 misses. 15 contacts inside 3.5 kilometers. Running count, 4:02 a.m., second 1094, ESSM 0, SM6 0, SM2 0, RAM 9 remaining, CIWS 100%, 15 contacts at 1.8 to 3.5 kilometers. Sea skimmers, 4 contacts below 30 meters, CIWS tracking. Cost, $58.4 million. Time, 18 minutes. Fleet, no authorization on platforms received. The CIWS forward and aft entered autonomous engagement mode at 4:02 a.m. with 15 contacts inside 3.5 kilometers. 11 were at standard approach altitude of 180 to 400 meters. 4 were sea skimmers below 30 meters. CIWS forward took the 8 standard altitude contacts on the port forward arc. 11 bursts in 44 seconds, the elevated contact count requiring the mount to cycle at near maximum tempo, brief rotations between contacts, burst durations of 0.4 to 0.9 seconds per contact. 7 contacts fragmented and warhead initiated in the fragmentation clouds between 1,400 and 2,900 meters from the hull. 1 contact escaped the engagement sequence. A contact that had been queued fourth in the forward arc's engagement priority, but whose approach vector had placed it outside the CIWS forward's optimal engagement cone by the time the mount reached it after clearing the first 3. The contact passed the forward mount's coverage limit at 1,100 meters and entered the CIWS aft's coverage arc. CIWS. Aft took the 4 sea skimming contacts on the starboard and aft arcs, plus the escaped contact from CIWS forward now at 980 meters on the port arc. The sea skimming contacts required the aft mount to engage at near horizontal barrel depression. The 30-meter altitude contacts barely above the waterline return in the tracking radar's discrimination band. 3 sea skimmer engagements, first at 1,200 meters, burst 1.1 seconds, fragmented, warhead initiated. Second at 900 meters, burst 0.9 seconds, fragmented, warhead did not initiate, structural failure without fuse trigger. Third sea skimmer, the CIWS aft track, lost the contact in sea clutter between 700 and 550 meters. The contact re-entered the tracking envelope at 520 meters. CIWS aft burst, 1.4 seconds, 105 rounds. Contact fragmented at 480 meters. Warhead initiated at 480 meters from the hull. The detonation at 480 meters was the closest combat event in the ship's deployment. At 480 meters, the 40-kilogram warhead produced an overpressure wave that reached the hull as a sharp physical impact felt throughout the ship, not the distant pressure signature of a distant detonation, but a compressed, concentrated blow that rattled every loose item in every compartment, triggered automatic pressure sensor alarms in 3 spaces, and produced a 12-millisecond hull deflection measurable by the motion reference unit. The sound on the bridge was a flat, hard crack, immediately followed by a brief hiss of fragment spray against the forward hull plating. 14 fragments impacted the hull above the waterline. 3 impacted the forward CIWS mount housing. The forward mount continued operating. The escaped CIWS forward contact at 980 meters when CIWS aft reacquired it after the sea skimmer engagements. Burst 0.7 seconds, 52 rounds. Contact fragmented at 860 meters. Warhead initiated. Overpressure reached the hull as a secondary event following the 480-meter detonation. Felt as a second sharp impact 1.4 seconds after the first. RAM cells 13 through 21 engaged the remaining 5 contacts at 2.1 to 3.8 kilometers. 4 intercepts, 1 miss, a sea skimmer that had descended below 20 meters, and which the RAM passive infrared seeker had lost in the water surface thermal return at 2.4 kilometers. CIWS forward reacquired the contact at 1,800 meters. Burst, 0.8 seconds, 60 rounds. Contact fragmented at 1,550 meters. Warhead initiated. A third overpressure event reached the hull, softer than the first two due to greater range. At 4:05 a.m., both CIWS mounts were tracking no contacts. The SPY-6 confirmed no airborne contacts within 8 kilometers, bearing 228 to 252. All 80 contacts were assessed as neutralized. Running count, 4:05 a.m., second 1,261. All 80 contacts neutralized. 3 close-range warhead detonations, 480 meters, 860 meters, 1,550 meters. SM6 0, SM2 0, ESSM 0, RAM 0, CIWS forward 74%, CIWS aft 68%, 14 fragment impacts forward hull, 3 impacts CIWS forward housing, cost $71.8 million, time 21 minutes, platform status 4 platforms operational, fleet authorization still pending, running count 4:05 a.m., second 1,261, all 80 contacts neutralized. Closest detonation, 480 meters. SM6 0, SM2 0, ESSM 0, RAM 0. CIWS forward 74%, aft 68%. 14 fragment impacts forward hull. 3 on CIWS forward housing. 2 crew minor injuries. Fleet, authorization granted 5:44 a.m. Platforms intact, reload status unknown. Cost $79.0 million. Time 21 minutes. The damage assessment at 5:15 a.m. Forward hull above waterline, 14 fragment impacts, no structural penetration, 2 20-millimeter diameter holes in a non-structural hull plate above the main deck. CIWS forward housing, 3 fragment impacts on the outer dome, no penetration to the tracking radar or barrel mechanism. Forward mast, 2 fragment impacts on secondary antenna brackets, non-structural, no propulsion effects, no flooding, no electronic damage. Personnel, 2 crew members on the 03 level sustained lacerations from fragment spray, channeled through an open scupper during the 480-meter detonation. Both treated and returned to duty. The magazine assessment at 5:20 a.m., SM6, 0 of 8, SM2, 0 of 24, ESSM, 0 of 32, RAM, 0 of 21, CIWS forward, 74%, CIWS aft, 68%. All 4 missile inventories fully expended. The ship was operating on 2 partially loaded CIWS mounts. Against any airborne threat in the next 4 days before resupply, the outer, middle, and close-range missile layers were unavailable, and the 4 platforms were still there. At 5:44 a.m., Fleet transmitted the authorization assessment. The legal review had determined that the 4 platforms had lost their protected status under the law of armed conflict from the moment of UAV launch, and that engagement was authorized under the proportionality framework if the commanding officer assessed that the military advantage of neutralizing the launch infrastructure outweighed the expected harm to civilians aboard. The authorization had been granted. The destroyer had no weapons to act on the authorization. The supply officer assembled the accounting at 7 a.m. 80 commercial derivative UAV platforms at $12,000 average cost per platform, $960,000. Modified container racks for platform installation on the 4 petroleum structures, estimated hardware cost, $800,000. The modification of 4 operating petroleum platforms to serve as covert launch infrastructure, a months-long operation requiring access to the platforms, engineering work, concealment from routine maritime patrol activity, and coordination of the simultaneous launch timing, assessed at $3.2 million in planning, material, and personnel costs over the preparation period. Total adversary investment, approximately $4.96 million. U.S. munitions expended, 8 SM-6 at $2.1 million to $16.8 million, 24 SM, 2 at $1.2 million to $28.8 million, 32 ESSM at $450,000 to $14.4 million, 21 RAM at $900,000 to $18.9 million, CIWS ammunition, $72,000. Total, $79 million. Exchange ratio, 16-to-1 in the adversary's favor. The ratio was the lowest in this analysis series among adversary investments above $1 million. The decoy operation remained the lowest at 2.6-to-1 because the adversary's YJ-18 investment dominated that calculation. Against a comparable drone-only engagement, the 16-to-1 was lower than any prior drone engagement in the analysis because the platform preparation cost had substantially increased the adversary's investment. But the ratio did not capture the structural success of the adversary's operation. For $4.96 million, they had achieved something no prior engagement in this analysis series had achieved. They had operated from a position that the rules of engagement had protected for 11 minutes, long enough for the engagement to begin, for the SM-6 inventory to be committed, for the outer ring to be expended, before the legal framework caught up with what was operationally obvious from the first second of contact detection. The 11-minute authorization delay had not changed the engagement's tactical outcome. The weapons release had been authorized for the 80 airborne contacts from the first detection. All 80 were neutralized. The tactical outcome was complete. The authorization delay had, however, guaranteed that the platforms themselves would not be engaged during the engagement window. By the time authorization for platform engagement arrived, the ship had nothing to engage with. The adversary had built a reload capability into civilian infrastructure that required a 3-star authorization to engage, and the authorization process took longer than the engagement. The platforms were intact. They contained a reload capacity. A second salvo if the launch hardware had survived and if replacement platforms were already staged was theoretically possible within hours. The authorization for platform engagement was now in hand. The weapons to act on it were 4 days away. The intelligence community updated its assessment of all 4 platforms from no assessed military modification to confirmed dual-use military infrastructure. The updated assessment covered NFPA-11 through NFPA-14. It was transmitted to all vessels in theater. The transmission noted that similar modifications on unassessed platforms in the field were possible and could not be ruled out. Emergency resupply transmitted at 6:14 a.m. Full VLS reload RAM replenishment. ETA 4 days. There were 42 other petroleum platforms on the Qatar North Field.